Tuesday Night Touchdown Podcast with your hosts, Reese Downing and Jacob Workman.
What is up, everyone? It's Tuesday Night Touchdown Podcast, NCAA edition SEC preview. As we're moving closer and closer to week 0 of the college football season. Joining, as always, over on the far side of the screen, my friend Reese. What's up, Reese?
What's going on, brother? How are you?
Oh, we're good. We're I think I just read 7 weeks away from week 0, I think it is. So we're getting closer and closer.
Yeah, it's moving quickly.
So for the SEC, some new additions this year. We've got Texas and Oklahoma coming over from the Big 12. Reese, what are your thoughts on two kind of marquee names in college football joining the SEC?
Yeah, I mean, the SEC is already one of the, if not the biggest conference in terms of powerhouse teams. And then to add Texas and Oklahoma to that is pretty crazy. Obviously, we're creeping towards, I think, moving away from these smaller conferences and just having these massive conferences. It's already happening, and I think it's going to continue down that path. Adding Texas and Oklahoma specifically, I think, is awesome. It allows us to reintroduce some key rivalries like Texas A&M. Ensures that Texas and Oklahoma are going to continue to play, and ends up resulting in some really awesome matchups that we're going to be seeing for the foreseeable future. So I'm excited for the conference.
Yeah, really the only complaint I have is that I really feel like the SEC should have gone with a 9-game conference schedule. I don't like that they stuck with the 8. I think that's kind of chicken shit on their part, but that's the SEC. That's what they always do. So what we're going to get into to start, I'm going to take a look at some conference championship odds and win totals. All right, so as you can see, the favorite here, we have Georgia coming in at a plus 190 to win the conference and a win total of 10.5. And right behind them is Texas at plus 310 with also a 10.5 win total. Reese, taking a look at this, what are some things that stand out to you for the conference championship odds and season win totals?
Yeah, I mean, starting here at the top of Georgia, this one's a little interesting to me. Clearly, they're going to continue to be one of, if not the best team in the country, but they don't exactly have a cupcake schedule this year. 3 road games specifically on their schedule, at Bama, at Texas, and at Ole Miss are going to be particularly tough. Add in a home game against Clemson, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to say there's a possibility they could lose 2 games this year. Interesting to see Bama move down a little bit at the top of the ranks after being one of the 2 powerhouses in the SEC for so many years. I don't see them sliding significantly, moving from Saban to DeBoer. We saw what Coach Kalen is able to do in Washington, so I'm excited to see what he's going to be able to do with this Bama team. I do like the plus 112 and the over there. Love Ole Miss, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit more detail. And then lastly, one thing I wanted to point out here is looking at Florida, coming off a pretty disappointing season from last year, and they've moved into arguably the toughest college football schedule this year. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit as well. But, realistically, it's kind of hard to think that Florida may come out with 4 or less wins. But when we go through the schedule, you'll see that it is not going to be an easy path to get over 4.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously anyone that listens to the show knows I hate Florida, but yeah, that schedule, I don't even know if I would have made them that schedule. Like it's bad. It's real bad. So Reese, you did mention a little bit about Ole Miss there. So let's take a look at Ole Miss. Well, let's start. I think I know the answer since you mentioned it, but what is your favorite bet for the conference championship?
Yeah, so we just kind of teased it a little bit here, but my favorite bet for conference championship is Ole Miss at plus 700s. I was vocal all year last year about how much I like Kiffin's team. This year, I think they're set up particularly well to be in a position at the end of the year to compete for the conference championship. For starters, they rank number 1 in the transfer portal. That speaks to Coach Kiffin's ability to connect with his players. And we'll talk about the transfer stuff and who they brought in a little bit later. But looking at the schedule, I don't see many losses here, and I know you and I are thinking a little bit differently on this, but Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern, Kentucky, at South Carolina, those first 6 games, I have every single one of those as W's. Moving into LSU, that's an asterisk game for me. I think there is a possibility they lose, but I do have them winning that. Moving through their bye week, and then they have a home game at Oklahoma. I've got a W for them there. Going on the road to Arkansas, I've got a W there. The Georgia game is the one where I think they do have the potential to lose. That said, there are a couple really tough games that Georgia's going to have to play before they meet Old Miss, and I think that could beat the team up a little bit. So we'll see what happens with that. And then ending their season at Florida and home against Mississippi State. I have those as W's as well. So I really only have one game that I think is definitely potentially going to be a loss. And then we've got at LSU as a question mark. And then we've talked about it a little bit. I think one potential hiccup they may run into is at South Carolina. And the only reason why I say that is because for whatever reason, South Carolina can have a bad team, but they show up against huge games or show up in huge games. So I've got them losing one game this year, which would put them in the over.
So the funny thing with this is they were your favorite for the conference championship odds, and I actually have them as my favorite win total bet to the under at under 9.5 at -102. It's almost even money there. So like you said, we're on the same page at the beginning. A 4-0 start with Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern. Saturday, September 28th is actually homecoming. They play Kentucky. I do think that's a tricky game. And then, like you just mentioned, they do go on the road to South Carolina right after that. And if that happens to be a night game, the time obviously is not announced yet. But I have said last year that is one of the most underrated environments in college football is it's Columbia, South Carolina, and what they do there. That crowd is insane. Like people truly don't realize it, but that is one of the best atmospheres in college football. If you put that as a night game, and that's also the lead-in game to a night game in Baton Rouge. So, I mean, there's some tricky stuff there. I don't know. That's a situational game, and sometimes those look-ahead spots are deadly. Then they get the bye, like you mentioned. They are going to be home against Oklahoma. I think that's a little bit of a. It's risky. We've got a defensive mastermind in Brent Venables against an offensive mastermind in Lane Kiffin, so that'll be a fun one to watch there. Arkansas, they should be okay, but it is on the road in the SEC. Georgia, obviously, is a tricky one. Another bye week, then they're playing Florida, and then the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State. So where I got my 3 losses was I think they might lose one of the Kentucky-South Carolina games. I think they'll lose in Baton Rouge or Oklahoma, one of those two. I think it'll be Baton Rouge. And then I think they lose to Georgia. So I think those are my 3 losses there. I'm not honestly too worried about that Florida game on the road late in the year. Billy Napier might not even have a job at that point. And then the Egg Bowl is one that you always do have to be a little iffy on just because the rivalry there is fun, but it is a home game. It's in Oxford, so you shouldn't have to worry too much. But that is where I got my 3 losses with Ole Miss.
Yeah, I think all that makes sense. I think the reason why I'm so high on Ole Miss this year is because if you look at the schedule, they avoid Bama, they avoid Texas, they avoid Tennessee, they avoid Missouri, who is, I think, could be a sleeper team. They're bringing back Brady Cook, Luther Burden. That's going to be the last year of that connection, and I think that offense is going to be pretty high-powered. But they do avoid some of those big-name games, so if they can take advantage of a softer schedule versus some of the other teams, I think they have an opportunity to get themselves into the conference title game. So that's kind of where my thought's at.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. So what did you have as your win total bet that you liked?
Yeah, so my win total bet is going back to the conversation that we just had here about Florida. So looking at Florida's schedule, man, this first game here, August 31st versus Miami, this Miami game is going to go a long way, I think, for them in terms of momentum. If they can start the season by beating Cam Ward, I think that's a step in the right direction for them to get over the 4.5. That said, I do think they lose this game, so I have that as an 0-1. Samford, next game up, I've got that as a win, so that brings them to 1-1. Texas A&M, I'm giving the win to Mike Elko here. He's going to have this team fired up in his first year to come in and make a statement in the swamp. So that moves Florida to 1-2. Next up, we've got at Mississippi State. Again, I think this is a winnable game. It is going to be a tough environment being at Mississippi State, but I'll go ahead and give them benefit of the doubt because they do have a decent transfer portal team. Or a decent, transfer portal pull in for all of the new guys there. So I'm going to give them a win there at 2-2. UCF, this is another winnable game, but I wouldn't sleep on this. The last time UCF played them was in the Gasparilla Bowl in 2021, and they beat Florida. Obviously different teams here, but I think, UCF inherently is going to come into this game wanting to beat them just because it's a Florida rivalry. I do have Florida winning this game, which would bring them to 3-2. But after that, there's not much here. So at Rocky Top, I've got that as a loss that moves them to 3-3. I have one potential win here at Kentucky because that's at Florida. So let's take them to 4-3 there. The rest of the season is loss, 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 loss. At Georgia, at Texas, home against LSU, home against Ole Miss, and at Florida State. I have all of those as losses. I don't see Florida winning a game past October. And to your point, and we're going to talk about coaches on the hot seat in a little bit here, I think Napier is definitely in that role right now. And I do not know if he's going to be the head coach by the end of the season.
Yeah, and they've got they're in a little bit of a situation too with I think it was Jaden Rashada, the recruit that was going to go to Florida, and there was a money situation, and he ended up leaving. He went to Arizona State, and he actually just transferred to Georgia, so he's back in the SEC now. But there was some situation with Jaden Rashada, and it comes to like an NIL deal that went wrong, and I think Napier, it might even be a lawsuit. So they've got a lot of things going on there that are not looking positive. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't see how they can get 5 wins this season. I mean, I guess if we want to be Miami, maybe, Samford 2, Mississippi State 3, UCF 4, Kentucky 5, I guess. That would be 5, but we mentioned it last week when we talked about Miami's win total. That week 1 game I feel like is deciding the win total for either one of these teams instantly. Whoever loses that game, I think it's a lock to the under.
I agree.
So we've gone over your conference champion and win total. My win total was also Ole Miss under, which was in your conference championship. So my conference championship favorite I have is actually Texas A&M. I'll tell you why. I like Mike Elko coming over. There's no, oh Lord, for those watching on YouTube, there's some wonderful animations of the dumbest thing in college football, the yell squad at Texas A&M. Good God. So Elko's coming over from Duke. Jimbo just got fired. Jimbo had all the pressure on the world on him when he got there. They gave him $80 billion. They gave him a trophy that said future national champions on it that clearly never came true. With that, there's a ton of talent. Elko is going to have an absolute loaded defense. I do know that Walter Nolan did transfer in the portal, but they're still loaded even without Walter Nolan. I think this team is very solid. The only weakness I really see maybe is a little bit on the offensive line, but everything else in this team, I don't know. I think it's all positive here. Schedule is pretty favorable also. So obviously this is a non-conference game, so this really doesn't matter, but they do start the season at home against Notre Dame, and what's going to be one of the biggest games of the season, I think, especially when it comes to playoff potential. Then they're going to play McNeese, which not a big deal. They do go on the road to Florida. I think it will be a decent road test early in the season, but like we just mentioned with Florida, I'm not too sure they're going to be able to live up to this. Then a MAC school, Bowling Green's going to Kyle Field. They're going to play Arkansas in Jerry World as they do every year. Kind of a tricky game, but I again don't foresee a problem. To me, this is the biggest game of the year right here. Well, maybe second biggest game of the year. Saturday, October 5th, they play Missouri at home. I think this one's going to go a long way when it comes to conference championship just because all conference wins do matter. And Missouri's going to be one of those teams like you just mentioned that's going to be fighting for a conference championship spot as kind of a sleeper role. Another loaded portal team. Bye week, then they're playing at Mississippi State. Then they come home to play LSU. Then they're at South Carolina. Another team going to South Carolina in those tricky spots. And it is slated to be a night game. So, again, like I just mentioned, that's a sleepy environment there. Or sleeper environment. New Mexico State's not going to be a big deal. At Auburn, I don't really see being a big deal. The biggest one here, last game of the year, Saturday, November 30th, it's the return of the Texas A&M battle. It's in College Station. I like A&M here. So I think we can easily get them to the conference championship game. I guess if we're playing it safe, we give them, say they lose to LSU and they lose to Missouri, but beat Texas. I think they would then hold the tiebreaker over Texas and they would get in the conference championship still. So I do really like Texas A&M at the plus 2,100 to win the conference. I don't think it's that crazy to think that they could make it into the game. Connor Wegman back at quarterback. He's an NFL player. He's very solid. Their wide receivers are some of the best in the nation. Noah Thomas, Jade Walker, and then Moose Muhammad, which is Mushin Muhammad's son. It's crazy to think he can even be that old. But I don't know. I just think that they're a loaded team. I love Elko. I like what he does. And I think that Notre Dame game to start the year, I mean, what a way to start the season and maybe rejuvenate the fan base there that kind of dropped a little with Jimbo.
Yeah, I think there's going to definitely be a lot of fireworks in that August 31 game, and I think it's going to set the pace. If they win that game, I think that carries a lot of momentum towards them. The one that I'm most interested to watch, and you called it out there, was that game against Missouri. That one's going to be a lot of fun. That South Carolina game could be a little bit of tricky, especially because they're going to be playing LSU the week before that. So depending on how that game rolls out, they could come into South Carolina a little beat up. And then obviously that Texas game is going to be fun. So yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable to consider that there's a possibility that they could definitely end up in the conference title game.
So just for just to have a little fun here real quick, since Vandy is at 2.5, let's see if we can get Vandy. I'm going to run through their schedule. Tell me if you hear 3 wins. I'm just going to name the team and you say yes or no. Start the season with Vatek.
No.
So week 2, the Alcorn State Braves.
I'll give them a W.
Then they're going to Georgia State.
Let's give them a W there. Start the season 2-1.
So we are at 2. We only need one more to hit the over. At Missouri.
Nope. Loss.
Bama.
Loss.
Kentucky.
Loss.
Here's where it gets fun, especially for this podcast. Ball State.
L, baby.
Well, if they're losing to Ball State, then I don't think they're hitting the over because we got Texas, Auburn, and South Carolina next.
Khalil Kelly is going to be making his stance for the Heisman in that game.
LSU and Tennessee to wrap it up.
Yeah, loss and loss. It's going to be a rough season.
So if they lose the Ball State, then I actually don't even know if they beat Georgia State, to be honest. So even if they beat Alcorn and Ball State, that's only 2. So probably not hitting the over there. To start 2-1 and then not hit the over on a 2.5 that'd be terrible.
Yeah, it'd be pretty rough.
All right. So we got some coaching changes in the conference. Jeff Lebby coming over from Oklahoma as the offensive coordinator and quarterback coach. He is the new head coach at Mississippi State. Anyone that's watched him knows a little bit more of like a gimmicky offense. A lot of bullshit going on always. I think it'll be very fun when they play other offensive teams. It's going to be some high scoring games. Just have to wonder what on earth they're going to do on defense. They are a little tough to prepare for on offense, though. As we just mentioned, Mike Elko coming over from Duke as the head coach, new head coach at Texas A&M. I think he's in a great spot. Like I just said, there's not as much pressure on him like Jimbo had, and he's coming into an absolutely loaded defense. And then my guy, anyone that listened last year knows I love Kalen DeBoer. Coming over from Washington off a national championship game appearance to be the new head coach at Alabama. Pairing him with Jalen Milroe, Jesus, fireworks are going to be going in Tuscaloosa. It's not going to be what people are used to there. That's going to be one of the more fun things to watch in the college football season. Reese, thoughts on the 3 new head coaches?
Yeah, I mean, overall, SEC's got a pretty stacked coaching conference going on here. A&M bringing in Elko and Bama bringing in DeBoer obviously take the cake. Lebby steps into his first head coaching role after stints at Oklahoma, Ole Miss, and UCF. Taking over for Arnett, I don't think the bar is too terribly high for him, so he'll be able to implement that run and shoot and get my my QB, Mr. Dak Prescott's alma mater, moving in the right direction. DeBoer, biggest impact hire here, I think, at Bama. Bama could have had a lull after Saban leaving, but instead they went and grabbed a coach that's gone 104-12 in his career. He won 21 straight games with the Huskies. He beat Texas twice, made the Natty in his second year at Washington. I don't think Bama could have found a better replacement in Kalen DeBoer. Elko steps into a tremendous position with all the resources and recruiting prowess that A&M has. That fan base is going to be behind him because I think by the time Jimbo was out of there, everybody was like ready for a change. They were ready for a change a year before it happened, I think. He'll be able to recruit and grow A&M into something that Jimbo wasn't able to do. So it's going to be fun to see how he can take the Aggies into the upper echelon over the course of the next few years in the SEC.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is I think Elko will do more with the talent. Jimbo was bringing in, I mean, one of the recruiting classes was the number 1 class. I think Elko will actually coach them and develop them and make them into what they should have been. So one of the questions I have also is, so what SEC coach, I think we hinted at this a little earlier, but what SEC coach do you think has the most pressure on them to win this season?
Yeah, I've got three here. Starting with Sam Pittman at Arkansas, he's entering his 5th year with Arkansas. He's got less than a 50% winning percentage. That's the lowest in the SEC for a coach that's been there that long. I was honestly surprised he didn't get let go at the end of last year. So I know he's got to be feeling the heat, especially with Bobby Petrino coming in as the new offensive coordinator. Because I think if he does end up going, Bobby may be the auto replacement there. Clark Lee at Vandy, another one to watch. Went 2-10 year one. Looked to be bringing some momentum into year two. They went 5-7, so there was an improvement there, which was the first time the Commies had won more than 5 games since 2018. But they backslid last year. Went 2-10 again. To make matters worse, he can't retain a quarterback. He previously lost Mike Wright. They lost AJ Swan and Ken Seals to the transfer portal, so this was probably going to be the last year for him at Vandy. But the big one for me, I think, is Billy Napier, probably the hottest seat right now, particularly because the Gators rank so highly in the transfer portal. If he can't turn that into wins and a bowl berth by the end of the year, I think he's going to be shown the door. And it may not take the end of the year for it to happen. If they hit a skid early and they're below 500 going into the middle of the season, they may just pull the plug on him and pull an interim coach in and start looking for their next replacement.
Yeah, Napier was, I had 2 listed. Napier was the main one, obviously. I do agree with you on Pittman, though. I think this will be Pittman's last year, and Clark Lee, Vandy, we're probably looking at the same path there. Also, I don't foresee. Obviously, we just talked about them not even winning 3 games. So, but yeah, Napier. I just think Florida is one of those schools that they're not going to deal with that. Like, I just feel like they want a big name coach. Now, who's out there? That's another story. But I mean, maybe even if Captain Fake Heart Attack Urban wants to come coach again, maybe they'd be willing to welcome him back. I don't really know how want to turn it back into a murderer's paradise. Then I guess they could do that again. But the I don't know. Napier is iffy. I don't know if they're going to give him some leeway with the way that the schedule is and all of that. But like I said, with that stuff with Rashada and that NIL deal, I think Napier might be gone earlier than people think, honestly. My other coach, and this was just kind of, I think this is a little of a stretch, but I put Kalen DeBoer. You're filling in for Nick Saban. Like, I just feel like the Bama fans, I don't think they're going to, like, if you only win 8 games, I don't think the Bama fans are going to be happy. Like, I feel like the pressure is natural for them to be there. And to walk into a place like Alabama and have Jalen Milroe already with you, a Heisman candidate, like, I just feel like that's a situation where I couldn't even imagine. Like, I feel like the most pressure on earth would be on me if I was filling in for Nick Saban. So I did go with DeBoer there as my other one.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to see Bama giving up on him after 1 year.
Oh, no, I'm not saying hot seat or firing or anything. I'm just saying pressure.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Yeah. Definitely a lot of pressure. Bama's been one of the top programs for the last 20 years. So yeah, definitely a lot of pressure walking into that. But I think if anybody's going to be able to withstand that pressure and turn it into wins, it's DeBoer.
Yeah, I agree. So we're going to get into some notable impact transfers in the portal class rankings for the SEC. As you mentioned earlier, Ole Miss did come in as the first ranked class in the portal. Alabama was 3rd, A&M was 4th, Florida was 5th, Texas was 6th, Missouri was 14th, Georgia was 15th, South Carolina even at 16th is a little surprising. Oklahoma was 20th, and Kentucky was 21st. Before we get into the individual players, any thoughts on those?
I mean, extremely impressive that they have 5 of the top 6 transfer portals in the. I mean, maybe it's not especially surprising just because it's the SEC, but I mean, Ole Miss being that high up, to your point, South Carolina being in the top 20 is a little eye-opening. That's pretty crazy. Overall, extremely impressive. It looks like virtually everyone, went hard in the paint, so to speak, with the transfer portal stuff. Like, nobody went the Dabo Swinney, I'm just not going to do anything and sit on my hands role. So, and I think all of these teams need to do that, because when you add teams in like Texas and Oklahoma, like, there's every team in this conference is going to have to be very, very aggressive in the transfer portal moving forward in order to compete, because the competition is going to be tight.
Yeah, I agree. Getting into some of these quarterbacks, and not all of these guys are going to necessarily be starters for these teams. They're just some notable quarterback transfers. Taylon Green, I talked about him a little bit last year, actually, when he was starting at Boise State. I like Taylon Green a lot, and going into Arkansas, going to be with Pittman. Pittman is, like you just said, on the hot seat, probably the hottest seat with Napier in the SEC. Taylon Green to me is just like raw talent. Like I feel like he can be an absolute stud. He's just got to develop a little bit. Brock Vandegrift, he was at Georgia. He's now going to Kentucky. Austin Mack followed Kalen DeBoer from Washington to Alabama. Jaden Rashada, which I've mentioned a few times on this episode, was committed to Florida on a huge NIL deal. Something happened there, went wrong. That's where all the issues are now. He actually ended up going to Arizona State with my guy, Coach Dilly. And then now he is transferred to Georgia to be the backup to Carson Beck. Oklahoma quarterback Davis Bevels now at South Carolina. Arizona State quarterback Drew Pine is now at Missouri, which he will be a backup. One of my favorite, this guy is awesome. So Diego Pavia, he was at New Mexico State. He actually is famous. If anyone remembers the story, he went to New Mexico, their rival, when he was at New Mexico State, and actually just pissed right in the middle of their indoor practice facility. It became a huge story. So Diego Pavia is kind of a dog. He's awesome. I don't know how I hope he's their starter at Vandy. And Vandy also got our running sensation last year from Utah that we talked about a lot, Nate Johnson. So I don't know if it's a 2-quarterback system they're going to have there or which one's actually going to start, but Diego Pavia will always be an infamy in college football. Robbie Ashford transferred from Auburn to South Carolina. Florida Atlantic quarterback Casey Thompson's now at Oklahoma. And North Carolina quarterback Jacoby Criswell is now with Arkansas, also with Taylon Green. I would still assume Taylon Green's going to be the starter there, but like I said, he does need a little bit of work, so we'll see what happens. And with Pittman being on the hot seat, we might see both of those guys, to be honest. Some other notables. One of the biggest recruits in college football, Cormani McClain, cornerback. He went to Colorado. He is now at Florida. Following him is Jason Zandamela from USC. He's an interior offensive lineman. Texas A&M brought in Alabama quarterback Des Ricks and Purdue defensive end Nick Scourton. Tennessee brought in offensive tackle Lance Hurd from LSU. Two of the biggest transfers, actually, on the defensive side of the ball in college football, both ended up at Ole Miss and greatly helped them become that number one class in college football. We might butcher the name here, but Florida defensive end Princely Umenmielen and defensive lineman Walter Nolan from Texas A&M both going to Ole Miss to booster that D-line. Wide receiver London Humphreys from Vandy is now at Georgia. Isaiah Bond was a huge one, transferring from Bama to Texas. And one last one I added here. This was a dumb story. Alabama offensive tackle Caden Proctor transferred to Iowa because of an NIL deal and then ended up coming back to Alabama. So I don't know if he got the NIL deal from Iowa still or how any of that works, but he actually was enrolled in Iowa and went there and then came back. So he's technically a transfer. Reese, what are your thoughts on all of these transfers that we just talked about?
To start off here, I love the Walter Nolan and Princely pickups for Ole Miss. That really solidifies that front defensive unit. Should help put some pressure on QBs throughout the year. Isaiah Bond to Texas is huge. Brock Vandegrift to Kentucky, Austin Mack to Bama, Jaden Rashada to Georgia, all QBs to keep an eye on. A couple of guys to keep an eye on from an impact standpoint that aren't listed here. Guys like Keon Saab and King Mack, both safeties heading to Bama, which is crucial for them because they had to replace 4 starting defensive backs, including Caleb Downs, who left for Ohio State, and both Terry and Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry, who went to the draft. And then another couple of guys who may make a substantial impact. Trevor Etienne, who I know is your favorite running back in the country. Jaquindon Jackson, particularly looking at him last year, Arkansas's leading rusher was their quarterback, KJ Jefferson, who had under 450 rushing yards. Not a single back at Arkansas had close to 400 yards. So with Raheem Sanders last year was battling injuries and then he left for the transfer portal. Arkansas historically has some really high level running backs. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get the ground game back going to help turn around that 4-8 record from last year, in addition to adding Taylon Green to the mix. So just a couple additional guys here to take a look at as the season progresses.
Yeah. And since you mentioned him, let me talk about the disgrace of the ETN family. So you got one of them that goes to Clemson The other one goes to Florida. And not only did he go to Florida, he then he transfers to their rival Georgia. One of my favorite things, Like what a family the Etienne family is. All right, Reese. Top 5 conference games you want to see this year. What do you got as your number 5 game?
My number 5 game, I have Texas versus Oklahoma in Dallas on October 12th. Another great rivalry that's now an SEC battle. Oklahoma pulled out the W against Texas in the final seconds of the game last year. So I'm guessing that Texas is going to come into that game looking for revenge. So that's what I have as my number 5.
Yeah, Red River Shootout, or as they call it now, the Red River Rivalry. But on this show, it'll still be the Shootout. That's a great game. I have it as my number 4 game, actually. Number 5, I have listed as Georgia versus Ole Miss on November 9th, just because I feel like we've got to get Ole Miss at some point to prove that they can be a good team. I think this is the year we finally see it. A home game against Georgia, November 9th. Here's your chance, Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin. Prove to us and prove to the world that you can be a real team and make the playoff. What do you have as number 4?
My number 4 is Texas at Texas A&M on November 30th. One of college football's best rivalries renewed here. We talked about it a little bit ago with Texas back in the SEC. This is the first matchup between these two teams since 2011. And Elko and the Aggies will have a chance to throw a wrench into Texas's hopes for an SEC title game berth in College Station. So that's going to be a fun one to watch.
And number 3?
Number 3 for me is Georgia at Texas, October 19th. Depending on how things shake out, this could be the first of 2 matchups for these teams. If they meet back up in the SEC title game, another tough road game for Georgia. So they're definitely getting tested this year.
So my number 3 was Alabama versus LSU on November 9th. Also the same day Georgia plays Ole Miss. So we've got 2 huge games that day in the SEC. I picked this one because I think this is a playoff potential game. I don't really think this is more of a SEC conference championship matter, but I do think the winner of this one goes a long way to making the playoff. Who do you have as number 2?
Number 2 for me is Georgia at Ole Miss. We already talked about it a good bit here, but this game being in the Vaught, I think makes this game even more interesting. So I've got Georgia at Ole Miss November 9th as my second game.
And my number 2 is Georgia on the road also, but it is at Alabama on September 28th. And Kalen DeBoer's first big home game, I feel. I think this is the prove it game for him. Jalen Milroe at home. If Milroe is going to win the Heisman, I think this is going to be the game where we see the stats and the numbers and the play that comes from it. I think this is the big one. Judging by what I've heard so far, I think we have the same number 1 game. But what is your number 1 game?
My number 1 game is actually Georgia at Alabama. What you just talked about. Okay. Georgia's looking to get revenge on Bama after that SEC title loss that knocked them out of the playoffs last year. 20-game winning streak. This is also an early game in the year, which I love. We're kicking things off with fireworks in the first full month of the season. So I've got this as my number 1.
Well, you might have already said this game. I might have just missed it. But so my number 1 game is Georgia going on the road to Texas on October 19th.
Yeah, that's my number 3 game.
Okay. So Georgia on the road at Texas. Welcome to the SEC, Texas. This is one of the games I want to see. I think it's going to be a huge game. Quinn Ewers against the Georgia defense, and then Carson Beck, again, another potential Heisman candidate. I just feel like we've got a lot of, when it comes to the Heisman this year, you almost have to expect it's going to be one of these quarterbacks from the SEC. I mean, obviously, we'll get a little bit more in detail to it when we get to the future bet episode, but in my opinion, I think we've got to look at some of these SEC quarterbacks. I actually threw in one more, just kind of like an honorable mention game, and we talked about this game earlier. Missouri at Texas A&M on October 5th is going to be another one of those prove it games. Missouri, we need to see them prove it. A&M, I think this one is kind of along the lines of my Alabama LSU. One of these teams, I feel like whoever wins this game is in great spot to make the playoffs.
Yeah, and even it was hard to narrow this down to 5 games.
I know it was very difficult. But even with the way that their schedules lay out, the winner of that game might even be in one of the front runner spots for conference championship game also. All right, so for the SEC Offensive and Defensive Player of the Year predictions, who do you have as your SEC Offensive Player of the Year?
I've got 2 guys listed here. The first one we just talked about, Jalen Milroe. He continued getting better as the season progressed last year, and now he's in a system with Kalen DeBoer's high-powered offense. They could easily see him leading the country in passing like your boy Michael Penix did last year in Washington. The other guy I have here as a note is Luther Burden at Mizzou. Physical playmaker. They make a point to get that dude high volume targets every single game, regardless of the opponent. He's going to have plenty of opportunities to rack up yardage and touchdowns in what, like we talked about, is going to be the last year for the Cook Burton connection. So that's my sneak pick if it doesn't end up going to a quarterback.
Yeah, my offensive SEC player of the year was Luther Burden. So that's we're on the same page there. He's phenomenal. Like he's always he gets open and he catches everything. Like he was one of the more fun things to watch in college football last year.
Yep, I agree.
So what do we have on the defensive side?
On the D side of the ball, I'm looking at Pierce out of Rocky Top. He led the SEC in sacks last year. He's likely going to be a top 10 pick in next year's NFL draft. Pancake machine, blast to watch battle in the trenches. So I've got Pierce as my pick for the defensive player of the year.
My defensive player of the year was Harold Perkins, the outside linebacker edge from LSU. He was one of the bright spots on that team last year that was very good. And I feel like he's a first-round NFL draft pick. And the numbers I think he's going to put up this year are going to be absolutely ridiculous. He's one of the more, I feel like, safer players to watch in college football when it comes on the defensive side of the ball. So we're going to wrap this up just like we did last week with the ACC. SEC championship game and who wins?
Yeah, so I can go the easy route and say Georgia, Texas, but I'm going to go with what I want to see, which is Ole Miss and Bama. If you look at these two team schedules, they have an easier path to perfection than Georgia and Texas do, in my opinion. You couple that with Ole Miss's perfect execution in the offseason and Bama bringing in DeBoer. I'm going to roll the dice and say Ole Miss and Bama in the conference title game. Final score 28-27.
Who wins?
Ole Miss.
Oh, wow. Ole Miss, SEC champion. Wow. Getting the auto bid into the playoff. So I went with Georgia. I just think Georgia will be too much and they will return. Their schedule is a lot tougher this year. So I do think that it is going to be a Georgia team that actually suffers some losses this year. But as you could probably guess by the way I've talked on this episode, the team I'm going to have them playing is Texas A&M in the conference championship game. I do have Georgia still winning the conference, though. But what I think this sets up is one of the more fun things about the way that the 12-team playoff is going to be set up. This should set up Texas A&M to be hosting a playoff game now, which we needed these home playoff games. I feel like the atmosphere in these are going to be insane. You put one of these at Kyle Field with 100 and what is it? Like 14,000. Like they have some crazy number of people they can fit in there. I feel like that's really going to bring out what college football is all about. Getting these playoff games on the home fields are going to be incredible. It's one of the things I'm really looking forward to at the end of this year. So my SEC champion is going to be Georgia. Yours was Ole Miss. Like we talked about a little earlier, I would like to see Ole Miss finally get over that hump. Like I feel like they're always one of those teams that's kind of built up, but they just lose those games they shouldn't lose. And I mean, if there's ever a year, I feel like it's this year.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So that is going to wrap up our SEC conference preview. Next week, we will return with the Big Ten conference preview. Got all kinds of new additions to that conference. That'll be fun.
The Big 20.
Yeah, no kidding. And then from there, we'll continue on with the Big 12. So for Reese Downing, I am Jacob Workman. We'll be wrapping up this one. If you can like, share, subscribe. We will also do some NFL previews if you want to check those out. But that is it. We will see you guys next week.
Cheers, guys.